Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Christmas morning smelled like cinnamon rolls, wood polish, and the kind of nerves that only come from years of pretending your family is fine when it's really a cracked up snow globe. The living room looked like a magazine shoot. White lights draped across the mantel, Mom's vintage porcelain village blinking softly under the tree, and Bing Crosby crooning something cheerful from the Bluetooth speaker tucked behind the angel figurine. Everyone looked comfortable. Everyone but me. I sat cross-legged on the edge of the beige couch, mug of coffee warming my hands, and kept my smile in place the way a waitress does when someone's yelling about overcooked eggs. Danny was still rubbing sleep from his eyes, rumpled in plaid flannel pajamas that probably cost more than my car payment. His girlfriend, Christy or Chelsea or something that ended in a Y, was perched beside him, giggling like she belonged there. I watched as my mom, with her red sweater dress and full makeup at 8 in the morning, stepped forward with something behind her back. The kind of overdramatic body language she saved for surprises. She turned toward Danny, and my stomach dropped before she even opened her mouth. "We saved the best for last," she beamed, holding out her hand. In her palm were a set of keys, silver, worn down around the edges, attached to a familiar leather fob. "Danny, sweetheart, your grandfather would have wanted you to have it." Danny blinked like he didn't understand, but Christy gasped before he could speak. Is that the Mustang?" Mom nodded, like she'd just handed over a kidney, and I swear to God, she dabbed at her eyes like this was some big emotional moment instead of a complete gut punch. "It's yours now. He'd be so proud." I didn't speak. Not a single word. I just watched the way Danny's mouth dropped open, then pulled into a boyish grin like he'd just gotten his first bike. He jumped up, hugged her like a game show contestant, and the room erupted into claps and laughter. Christy took a video on her phone. My dad chuckled from his recliner, lifting his coffee in salute. I raised mine too, mirroring the gesture like muscle memory. Nobody noticed my knuckles had gone white around the handle. What nobody in that room knew, what they would have known if anyone bothered to listen, was that Grandpa had told me the Mustang was mine. Not suggested, not implied. He had outright said it, sitting on the back porch last summer with his oxygen tank wheezing beside him, and his hand on my wrist like the truth needed to be physically transferred. "When I'm gone," he said, voice gravelly but firm, "that car's yours, not because it's worth something, because you know what it meant. We built that damn car together, weekends under the sun, grease on my elbows, eating sandwiches off the fender while the paint dried. Danny never touched it except to take prom photos leaning against the hood like he owned it. Grandpa had even made me promise to keep it in the family, not sell it. Said it carried stories in the steering wheel, said it had a soul. But now it was Danny's, just like that." They all went outside to see it parked in the driveway, red bow sagging slightly in the cold. I stayed back, offering to pour more coffee like a good daughter. When the door shut behind them, I moved quickly, reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope I'd tucked there before sunrise. Legal paper inside. Signed, stamped, clear. A copy of Grandpa's final handwritten will. The one I'd found in a manila folder in his workshop, wedged behind a drawer like it was hiding from someone. The one that very clearly stated the car, the tools, and the contents of the garage were to go to me, not Mom, not Danny, me. And no, it wasn't just a sentimental gesture. I had verified it, hired an attorney to make sure. It was legitimate, legal, binding. I waited until the noise outside got louder, Danny revving the engine like he was auditioning for a movie. And then I slid the envelope under my dad's dinner plate. Not Mom's, not Danny's, Dad's. Because he wasn't stupid. He knew the difference between a family surprise and a legal lie. And I had a feeling he'd recognize the date on that will. He'd remember the conversation he and Grandpa had on the back porch the night before the hospital visit. He'd remember because he'd been part of it. Dinner was ham and scalloped potatoes. Christy talked too much. Danny kept bringing up modifications he was going to make to his car. Mom pretended not to notice the way I had gone quiet. Dad sat down last, scooping up his napkin like always. and then paused when his fingers hit the envelope underneath. He didn't open it right away. He kept eating, slower now, distracted. But I saw the weight of that paper sink into his brain like ice water down the back. His smile thinned. He excused himself for a smoke, even though he quit last year. Took the envelope with him. Nobody noticed. Nobody but me. I finished my meal in silence. Let them bask in the glow of their make-believe generosity. The truth was out there now, ticking like a time bomb, and I was done playing the good daughter. Let the games begin. The house settled into its post-holiday quiet, like it always did, full of the low hum of leftovers being microwaved, wrapping paper still poking out from under the couch, and the weird heaviness that always followed my family after the decorations were taken down. But before the lights came off the tree, nobody said anything about the envelope. Not that day. Not the next. Dad didn't bring it up at breakfast, and Mom acted like everything was normal, going through the motions of loading the dishwasher and asking if anyone wanted more coffee, even though her eyes kept flicking toward the garage like she was waiting for something to go wrong. I held my tongue, watched, waited. That was the thing about revenge. The really good kind wasn't about dramatic showdowns or yelling in the kitchen while a ham dried out in the oven. No, the good kind was quiet, methodical, almost polite. It slipped in like fog under a door, unnoticed until the whole house was filled with it and you were choking on everything you thought you could ignore. 2 days after Christmas, I got the first call from my lawyer. Her name was Dana, sharp as a tack and 3 times as patient. She had this low, measured voice that made even bad news feel like something you could handle. We'd been working together since October, once I found that version of Grandpa's will buried in the garage drawer behind old invoices and a tin of buttons. I'd had a gut feeling something was off, and Dana confirmed it almost immediately. What we'd uncovered wasn't just a forgotten draft. It was the final, notarized version, written and signed 2 weeks before Grandpa passed, and it painted a very different picture than the one my mom had presented after the funeral. According to the version they had filed with the probate court, everything, house, car, garage, tools, was split between the children, which, in practice, meant Mom, who then made her own decisions about what went where. But the version I had told another story entirely. It gave the garage and its contents, including the Mustang, to me. It specifically named me, in Grandpa's own handwriting, saying I was to receive the car we rebuilt together and the space where our memories live. That was the exact phrasing. I'd read it over 100 times, like a mantra, like proof that I hadn't imagined all those summers under the hood, all those grease-stained moments of love and labor. It was mine, not theirs to give away like some game show prize. I knew confronting them head-on wouldn't work. My family didn't fight directly, they maneuvered, they manipulated, they smiled with teeth. So instead, I traced the paper trail. Grandpa's lawyer had retired, but not before forwarding copies of all his client files to the local county records office. Dana helped me file the request. We found 2 witness signatures on the version I had, neighbors who remembered stopping by the garage that day for a beer, and ended up signing a document without even realizing it was a will. Dana got affidavits from both of them. She put together a formal challenge to the estate and mailed copies to the appropriate parties. It was all moving fast, and still, inside that house, nobody said a word. Then, like clockwork, Danny did exactly what I expected him to do. He wrecked the Mustang. Not a big accident, nothing that totaled it, but enough to bend the bumper, scrape the paint off the left side, and shatter the passenger side mirror. He blamed it on icy roads and a deer that darted out of nowhere, but anyone who knew that car, who'd driven it the way Grandpa taught us to, would have known Danny had no business behind the wheel. The Mustang wasn't some modern vehicle with lane assist and a backup camera. It was a beast that needed finesse, a connection. Grandpa always said it was like dancing with a woman who didn't trust you yet. You had to earn her rhythm. Danny had stomped on the gas like it was a video game. He parked it back in the garage without a word, just sulked through the door and muttered something about needing estimates. I watched him from the hallway, arms crossed, and I didn't say anything. Not then. Not yet. That night, I went out to the garage after everyone had gone to bed. The Mustang looked worse up close. Scratches down the side like claw marks, rust already thinking about forming along the exposed metal. I reached into the glove box like Grandpa had once told me to, just like in his voicemail. I hadn't even remembered the message until that afternoon. I'd gone to charge my old phone, the one I'd used before switching to the newer model a few months back. I was scrolling through photos when I saw the voicemail icon. The little red bubble still there. I played it, and there it was. His voice, fragile but clear. If anything happens to me and someone tries to tell you otherwise, check the glove box. I left you something in there just in case. You always knew better than they did. You always saw the whole picture. Love you, kiddo. So I checked. Inside, beneath an old pair of sunglasses and a folded-up service manual, was an envelope with my name in his handwriting. Not Sarah, not sweetheart, just S, the way he always signed off on his notes to me. Inside were two things: the original car title, signed over to me, and a copy of the last will, again, the handwritten one. He must have made several copies, stashed them in different places, as if he knew someone would try to rewrite the ending after he was gone. There was one more thing tucked inside, a photo I'd never seen before. It was the two of us standing in front of the Mustang, me maybe 16, covered in dirt, smiling so hard my face could have cracked. Grandpa was holding up the hood like it was a trophy. On the back he'd written, "For the one who showed up, you earned this." The next morning, I sent a digital copy of the title to Dana. She called within an hour. "There's something else," she said, voice lower than usual. "I pulled more financial records like you asked. There was a transfer of funds from your grandfather's account to your father's, just days before he passed. A large one, marked for discretion. It's not illegal, but it does raise some questions." I stared at the floor, then out the window toward the garage. A cold knot formed in my stomach, and for the first time since Christmas morning, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about a car. It wasn't just about favoritism or broken promises. It was about trust, about betrayal, about how far people were willing to go when they thought nobody was looking. And I had been looking, all along. I hung up, walked back into the house, and sat at the kitchen table while the kettle boiled. Dad came in a minute later, slow and quiet, like he already knew something was happening but didn't want to be the first to say it out loud. He looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us spoke. The silence said enough. The air in the garage that night felt colder than it had any right to be, even with winter tightening its grip on everything it touched. The overhead bulb flickered slightly before it steadied, casting a dull yellow light across the Mustang's damaged front end, like it was exposing a crime scene rather than a careless accident. I stood in front of the car for a long time, longer than made sense, one hand still wrapped around the envelope I'd pulled from the glove box earlier, the other resting against the hood like maybe if I touched it hard enough, I could will back the time before everything had cracked wide open. The car had never just been about horsepower or paint jobs or how it looked pulling into the church parking lot on a Sunday. It had been our sanctuary, mine and Grandpa's. The one place where I wasn't competing with Danny for attention or being reminded that I was the independent one, which in family terms usually meant the one we don't worry about enough to actually listen to. We'd rebuilt the Mustang together, not because anyone asked us to, but because it was broken when we found it. And so were we. Every Saturday morning that summer, I'd shown up at his house without fail, even when I had better offers, even when my friends called me weird for preferring socket wrenches over swimming pools. I showed up. I always showed up. That mattered to Grandpa. I could tell. And now here I was, holding proof that he had tried to make sure it stayed mine. And somehow, still, they had managed to rip it out of my hands before I even knew I had to fight for it. But it wasn't just the car anymore. It was what it symbolized, what had been buried underneath all their smiles and sugar-coated lies. That car was my stake in the truth, and I was going to dig until I hit bedrock. The letter in the glove box hadn't been long. Grandpa wasn't the sentimental type in words, even though he had a sentimental heart. But what he did write was more than enough to blow a hole in everything Mom had said at Christmas. He referenced not just the car title, which I now held, but also a storage unit, the one he used after he sold the old farm tools and downsized. I remembered him mentioning it once when I helped him move some boxes a few years back, but I hadn't thought about it since. According to the note, the unit contained his backup records, in case something ever happened to the house, or, as he put it in his typical no-nonsense tone, if someone decides to get clever with what's mine after I'm gone. That wording stuck with me. Get clever. It sounded exactly like something my mother would do, all under the guise of family unity and what Grandpa would have wanted, as if repeating it enough times made it true. I spent the next morning calling every storage place in a 30-mile radius, until I found the one with his name still listed on a rental agreement. The woman on the phone didn't even blink when I said I was his granddaughter, just asked for my ID when I arrived, then pointed me toward Unit 47, the one in the back corner behind a leaning chain-link fence and a patch of asphalt that had seen better decades. The lock opened with a rusty groan. Inside, I found shelves lined with labeled bins, a couple of toolboxes, and an old filing cabinet that looked like it had survived more than one relocation. I expected to find receipts, maybe more copies of the will, but what I didn't expect were the journals. There were 3 of them, leather-bound, each about an inch thick. The first page of the top one just said, "If you're reading this, it means someone decided to play games with what's real, so here's my side of the story." The pages were filled with his handwriting, neat and methodical, covering everything from his childhood in Kentucky to how he met my grandmother, the early years of raising Mom, and then later what he called the dividing lines, the moments he noticed things shifting in our family. Like fault lines he could sense under his feet. He wrote about how Mom had started making decisions for him after his first hospital visit, how she'd taken control of his medications, his bank accounts, even tried to get him to move in with her. He didn't write it with bitterness, not exactly. He wrote it like a man observing his own erasure with a quiet sort of alarm. He wrote about Danny too, how he'd always seen the cracks in him, the way he wanted things without the work, the way Mom covered for him again and again. There was one passage I read 3 times, each time slower than the last. "Sarah's the one who came when it wasn't convenient. She didn't need something from me. She just came, every Saturday. She saw what mattered, even when everyone else just wanted the image." My throat tightened as I read that. It was strange how validation could hit harder than any lie. There was no anger in his words, just quiet disappointment, and an overwhelming sense that he knew exactly what was going to happen when he was gone. At the very back of the filing cabinet, I found a flash drive in a plastic bag labeled, "For her, if it comes to that." I pocketed it without opening it, trusting that whatever was on it would be worth the wait. I spent the rest of the day scanning and photographing every document in that unit, uploading them to a cloud folder Dana could access. When I returned home, the air had changed. Not just outside, though the wind had picked up and the bare trees scratched the siding like fingers. No, something inside the house had shifted too. Dad avoided my eyes. Mom was too cheerful. Danny hadn't mentioned the car again. It was like the truth had gotten under their skin, even if they hadn't spoken it out loud. That night, as the family settled into their usual after-dinner days, I opened my laptop in the guest room and finally checked the contents of the flash drive. There were scanned letters, financial records, and one video file. I clicked play. Grandpa's face appeared on the screen, seated at his workbench in the garage, the Mustang in the background. His voice was calm but firm, like he was giving instructions for a project we were about to start. He looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, then I was right to keep my guard up. I don't know what story they've told you, but I trust you to figure it out. You always asked the hard questions, always looked where others didn't. This car, this life, was never about stuff. It was about who showed up. And you did?" He paused, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "There's more I didn't put in writing, more about your father and what your mother's been hiding, but that part's your choice. Some truths come with a price." The video ended with him lifting his glass in a small toast. to the only one who knew where the real engine was. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence between the walls, the kind that only builds when everyone knows something's coming and none of them can stop it. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked out the window toward the dark outline of the garage. They'd tried to erase me, rewrite the story like I'd never been part of it, but Grandpa had left breadcrumbs, and I had picked up every single one. They weren't ready for what came next. But I was. The first time I noticed my dad starting to avoid me, it was subtle. Barely there, really, like a shift in wind direction or a flicker in the lights you tell yourself you imagined. He'd started taking his coffee outside instead of sitting in the kitchen like he always had. He'd smile when I walked into a room, but it was one of those tight-lipped, shallow smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the kind of expression people wear when they know something is coming but haven't figured out what they're going to say when it arrives. At first, I chalked it up to the usual family tension. After all, we were two adults stuck under the same roof for longer than either of us was used to. But the longer I watched him, the clearer it became that he wasn't just uncomfortable. He was guilty. There was a look people got when they were holding on to a secret that didn't belong to them. And my dad wore it like a badly buttoned shirt. The day after I watched Grandpa's video, I sent Dana a message asking if she could find out more about the transfer Grandpa had made to Dad just before he died. I didn't have the exact amount, only what she'd uncovered from the bank records. But something about it had started to nag at me, a sense that this whole thing wasn't just about a car or even the will itself. It felt like the Mustang had been the first thread I'd pulled, and now the whole sweater was unraveling, line by line, memory by memory. Dana replied the next morning with a scanned statement, sent in encrypted format, along with a note that simply read, "You're not going to like this." I opened the file while sitting alone in the guest room, the midday light pouring through the blinds like it was trying to soften the blow. The transfer had come from Grandpa's personal savings account marked, "For Family Resolution." The amount was $65,000, wired directly to my father 3 days before Grandpa passed. There was no memo line explaining it, no formal contract, just the transfer and a digital signature. What made it worse, what made my stomach knot up in a way I couldn't untangle, was that it had happened the same day my mother filed the printed version of the will with the probate court. Suddenly, things that hadn't made sense started falling into place with chilling clarity. Grandpa had rewritten the will by hand, had gone out of his way to name me as the beneficiary of the garage and its contents, and then somehow, magically, a cleaner, more generalized version had been the one used in court. One that split everything evenly, giving Mom full authority over how it was distributed. And now, with $65,000 in the mix, the math wasn't just suspicious. It was damn near obvious. They'd paid him off, or he'd accepted money to keep the peace. Either way, the man who used to lift me onto his shoulders and call me his number one girl had traded away my legacy like a used lawnmower at a yard sale. I didn't go nuclear. I didn't storm down the stairs and demand answers. That wasn't my style, and besides, I already knew the truth would hit harder if it came in silence, like all good truths do. Instead, I made copies of the transfer record, added it to the cloud folder I shared with Dana, and then spent the afternoon printing a few choice documents I planned to deliver in person. I was no longer just contesting the will. I was opening a full-blown case against both my parents, and it was going to get ugly. That evening, the family gathered for dinner like they always did. Mom had made her famous meatloaf, which meant it was dry and needed extra ketchup, and the conversation circled around the usual safe topics: local news, weather, the grocery store running out of decent butter. Danny was unusually quiet, likely nursing the bruised ego of someone who had recently realized classic cars don't drive like video games. Christy had gone back to her parents' house 2 towns over, probably tired of the drama she didn't understand. I let the silence build. Then, in a moment so casual it could have been mistaken for boredom, I pulled out my phone and tapped a few buttons. Every single member of the family had, at one point or another, been part of a shared group chat, mostly for scheduling birthdays and holiday dinners. That night, I dropped 4 PDFs into the chat. The handwritten will, the original car title in my name, the bank transfer receipt, and a clip of Grandpa's video message. I didn't include a message. I didn't need to. I simply hit send and placed the phone face down next to my plate. It took 20 seconds before my aunt replied with a confused question mark. 30 before my cousin texted, "Wait, is this real?" Mom looked at her phone, then at me, and for the first time since Christmas morning, her expression cracked, barely but enough. Dad didn't even look up. He just set his fork down gently, hands folded in his lap like someone waiting for a verdict. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. "I think we should talk about this privately," Mom finally said. Her voice clipped and forced into a polite tone that didn't suit her face. "No," I replied, calm and even. "I think we should have talked about it honestly 2 weeks ago, but since we didn't, I thought we could all learn together." Danny muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch, and frankly, didn't care to. He had no legal ground to stand on, and he knew it. Without the car, he was just another adult child living on borrowed time and borrowed validation. And now that the truth was out, he couldn't play the golden boy anymore. That night, long after the dishes had been cleared and the house had gone uncomfortably quiet, I got a call from my Aunt Lillian. She was Grandpa's sister-in-law, a sharp-tongued woman with a spine made of rebar and a memory like a steel trap. "I think it's time you come by," she said without any preamble. "There's something in the attic you need to see. He left it for you. I didn't want to get involved, but, well, things are different now." I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I just said I'd be there in the morning and hung up. The next day, I drove across town to her weather-beaten colonial and followed her up the narrow stairs to the attic. It was cluttered and smelled like dust and old cedar, the kind of space that makes you feel like you're trespassing even when you're invited. She pulled down a box wrapped in twine and handed it to me. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, with my name and Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. It was thicker than the one I found in the glove box. He had more to say, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it, but I opened it anyway. The envelope in my hands didn't weigh much, not physically anyway, but I could feel its importance the moment I touched it, as if some part of my grandfather's will, his actual will, not the one doctored up and paraded around by my mother, still lingered in the fibers of the paper. Aunt Lillian didn't ask any questions, didn't hover, didn't offer commentary like I half expected her to. She simply nodded once, turned, and made her way back down the creaky attic stairs with the kind of quiet respect that only someone who had lived long enough to know when not to interfere could manage. I stayed up there alone for a while, cross-legged on the dusty old trunk that served as a makeshift table, with my hands resting on the envelope like I was holding a relic from a time that no longer existed. When I finally broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages inside, my breath caught before I even read a single word, because I could already feel what was coming. The first page didn't begin with "Dear Sarah" or "My dearest granddaughter," nothing flowery or overtly sentimental. It started with the kind of plain-spoken, bare-boned honesty that only my grandfather could deliver, words carved straight from whatever was left of the old-world values he clung to. He had titled the letter "For the One Who Showed Up," and in that moment, everything else fell away. The legal noise, the awkward family dinners, the fake smiles, the bank transfers, the hollow compliments. For once, there was only truth. He began by recounting a story I'd forgotten until I read it again through his eyes. A Saturday in June, blistering hot, when I was maybe 14 or 15, and I'd biked 10 miles across town because my mom had refused to drive me over. He said I showed up with grease already on my jeans from a chain that had fallen off halfway there, and without complaint, went straight to work sanding down a rusted panel while he fixed us lunch. He said that was the day he realized I wasn't just a helper or a good kid, but someone who understood what it meant to keep showing up when no one else did. He wrote about how most people confuse effort with presence, how Danny always said the right things and made just enough of an appearance to get the credit, but how I, quiet, stubborn, steady, never needed to be asked twice. He said the car wasn't the point. It never had been. It was the proof. The proof that legacy isn't made of things. It's made of choices, especially the kind no one sees. But as I turned to the second page, the tone shifted. He began to outline things I hadn't known, things that tilted the entire history of my family on its axis. He wrote about how my mother had, over time, isolated him from many of his oldest friends and even some family members, using the excuse of stress or declining mental clarity to filter what he saw and heard. She'd taken over his finances under the pretense of helping, then slowly begun to shift accounts, reassign assets, and build a paper trail that painted her as the sole caregiver and most deserving heir. He admitted, with a heaviness I could feel through the ink, that he'd let her do it. Not because he trusted her, but because he was tired. Tired of the arguments. Tired of being treated like a burden in his final months. He confessed that he had considered moving in with Aunt Lillian, but decided against it because he didn't want to fracture the family even further. He thought if he gave her some control, she might back off. She didn't. Instead, she made herself queen of the hill and crowned Danny as the prince, carving me out like I was an inconvenient cousin who'd shown up uninvited to a funeral. What cut deepest was what came next. He detailed how, after seeing my father's hesitation to get involved, he offered him a deal, not in the way you might imagine, not some backroom bribe, but a practical compromise. He gave my father money, a sizable amount, in exchange for keeping the peace and making sure the truth was buried. He did it, he wrote, because he believed I would find my way to it eventually. Because I had always been the one who asked too many questions and took nothing at face value. Because he believed I would do something better with the truth than just use it as a weapon. There was a line, handwritten with extra pressure that had bled a little through the page, that I read over and over. I couldn't save you from the way they love unevenly, but I could leave you a map. You deserve better than silence and scraps. The final pages were softer, almost like a confession wrapped in a blessing. He told me to forgive what I could, but never to forget what was stolen. He said that family is supposed to be built on love, but sometimes it's held together by secrets and guilt, and I didn't owe anyone forgiveness just because we shared blood. He asked me to choose my next steps carefully, not to punish out of spite, but to act with the kind of clarity that makes it impossible for lies to take root again. And then he signed it with 3 simple words. You were enough. I didn't cry then, not yet. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and stood up in the dim attic light with the strange feeling that something sacred had ended. Even if nothing visible had changed, I didn't tell Aunt Lillian what it said. She didn't ask. We hugged on the front porch, and she told me to take my time. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I took the long way through town, past the church, the high school, the old gas station Grandpa used to insist had the only decent donuts for 50 miles. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sun was starting to dip, and the house looked the same as it always had, quiet, warm, almost welcoming. It was a lie, but a familiar one. I didn't go inside right away. I walked to the garage, stood in front of the Mustang, and let the silence stretch between us like a conversation neither of us wanted to start. The damage was still there, but I saw it differently now. It was no longer a symbol of what was taken. It was a reminder of what I knew, of what I had rebuilt before anyone else noticed it had value. I didn't want the car anymore. Not really. Not because I didn't love it, but because the fight wasn't about possession. It never had been. It was about being seen. About someone finally admitting that I mattered. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, this one addressed to Danny. Inside, I placed a full copy of the original will, the title in my name, and a photo of Grandpa and me in the garage, our arms around each other, smiling with oil on our hands. I added a sticky note with one sentence. You can keep the car, but now you know whose it really is. I left the envelope under the windshield wiper and walked back toward the house. As I reached the porch, I paused. In the window, I could see Dad watching from the hallway, face unreadable, a ghost behind glass. I didn't wave. I didn't go to him. I stepped inside, past the pictures on the wall, past the people who thought they'd won, and into the guest room where I began writing everything down. I don't know what they'll do when they find the envelope. I don't know if Danny will drive the Mustang again or sell it for parts. I don't care. The point wasn't to take back what was mine. The point was to remind them that I had never stopped paying attention. And now they have to live with the truth parked in their driveway.